Hello, my friends in the gathering. Pastor Bob coming to you for another week in Genesis. We're going to be jumping into Genesis chapter 34 through 36. And I'm excited to cover this with you and looking forward to just learning more we can about what God has for us here in the scriptures at the tail end of Jacob's life, but also moving into a discussion about his son. So how about we get started and I'll pray and we'll get going. Gracious Father, thank you so much for the opportunity we have to come and connect with you, with each other through technology. Thank you for your word. And God, we thank you for the book of Genesis that shows us so much depth and beauty to who you are and to what you have for us. And so, Lord, may we learn from Jacob and from the patriarchs. May we learn from what you want us to know, what you want us to see, and how we are to live as children of yours. Holy Spirit, I do pray for your help in helping me to teach the way that you would want me to teach. And I pray that you yield back anything that is not of you. And so whoever may be watching this right now and where they may be resting, help them just to connect deeply to the truth you have for them in the word. We love you. And it's in Jesus' name I pray. Amen. All right, here. Well, let me get my screen shared and I'll get us going here. All righty. Let's get going. Okay. So again, always want to thank Bill Epley and the team for allowing Pastor Ryan and I to come and speak with you each week. It is quite the blessing and it's certainly the opportunity for us to connect with you. We are grateful. So again, we're covering God's promises, Genesis 16 through 50 this summer. Last week, Pastor Ryan covered verses 30 through 33 with you. And now I'm jumping into 34 through 36. And again, we have a lot to cover, so let's just get moving. We're going to talk about Jacob now that he has been given the name of Israel and what Pastor Ryan covered, how that plays out here in this narrative. So the 12-week theme we have as a church for the gathering this summer is God's promise, faith through families. The theme for the summer, God's promise, faith through families. And so let's take a real quick look at what Pastor Ryan covered last week as we jump into the discussion here or our lesson here. So to recap, he just covered Genesis 30 through 33, and in that we learned that Jacob was blessed, that God prospers Jacob immensely, regardless of what he went through, that also Jacob and Esau had a reconciliation, that Jacob was transforming in this process, and that Jacob was wrestling with God in this process throughout all that he was doing. Now, what I want to do real quick is just share with you a little bit in this time that we're in a transition phase for Jacob. He is still going to struggle in what we're going to see, and he's going to grow immensely in this next section. And we're going to have to hone in on what's going on here because we're going to get a sense that some things still aren't right with him. And again, he's human like we are. Sin does abound in those areas. But in his life, there is going to be some real things that we have to take a look at, especially with his boys and with his kids. So I'm going to just jump us right back into our lesson. I want to take a pause so we can discuss that real quick. So again, he is renamed and he's resettled in this new region after meeting his brother Esau and reconciling with him. And we're going to take a look at his family line here, particularly the Jacob, Leah, Rachel, Bilhah, Zilpah section of the scriptures. And then we're going to move down into all his boys there. Now, what's important is notice here that in all of this, Jacob only had one daughter, and that's Dinah. And she's going to be the first tragic character of our story. But before I get to that, let's take a look at where we are. We are in the region of Shechem, a very important area. It's north of Jerusalem here. This is the travel of Jacob as he moved further south and into the regions, as he's going away from Laban in that section. And this is kind of where he landed. Here's some modern day look. On the far right, you have the ruins of Shechem. On the top left, you'll have Mount Gerizim. That's a view today. But in the bottom left, you're going to see a seeing stone from Canaan. And so that gives us a little bit of a picture of who's around them at this time period in Canaan. These folks who were not people of God, who were meant to be separated from Israel. And again, this big heart for them not to interact or intermarry with them. And this will be a big theme as we cover the next few chapters. So we're going to pick right up here in tragedy strikes, but hope lies in Israel. And that is in Jacob, in God's people. So let's look at chapter 34. And again, the tragic story of Dinah, Jacob's only daughter. This is going to lead us into the story of the spoiling of Shechem. And we do have to start off with this tragic story because it builds up as we move through here into the next stages of our lessons. So as always, I'd like to give you the breakdown of the chapter. You have this tragedy of Shechem. That is the son of Hamor, who is pretty much the ruler of the region that Jacob had landed in, and then he bought land from. So Shechem rapes Dinah and seeks to marry her. Hamor and Shechem, again Shechem's dad, propose a marriage alliance with Jacob's family. Then we have all these subcategories in the story, which I'm not going to run through, but they're on your screens. You can take a look at them. And then the third act here is Hamor and Shechem put terms for marriage alliance to townsfolk, to their people, and then Jacob's sons rape the town. And again, I know that word rape is harsh, but it's meant on purpose because that's how it's used in the scriptures, but also to show the tragedy of what's going on here. So let's take a look at our first scene. Shechem rapes Dinah and seeks to marry her. Now Dinah, the daughter of Leah, whom she had borne to Jacob, went out to see the women of the land. And when Shechem, the son of Hamor the Hivite, the prince of the land, saw her, he seized her and lay with her and humiliated her. And his soul was drawn to Dinah, the daughter of Jacob. He loved the young woman and spoke tenderly to her. So Shechem spoke to his father Hamor, saying, "Get me this girl for my wife." Now, as we recall, Dinah is the first daughter of Jacob, but she's also the first daughter of any patriarch mentioned so far. Now, this doesn't mean that there weren't other daughters in the family line, but they weren't mentioned in Scripture, so we're going to assume that this is the only daughter that God wants us to focus on in the line of the patriarchs. So here, her long title suggests that the reader is being urged to view her with a high emotional tension. This is an in-depth description pointing to Dinah as the daughter of an unloved Leah and the tied to Jacob from actual physical intercourse. So they're trying to show that she was unloved. She's mentioned as a daughter of Leah, not really Jacob's daughter. And then there was, as if the author had to give proof that she was literally born to Jacob, came from him, that he should have some ties to her. But this does set up a tension for what we're going to see here in a minute. Now, this phrase where it says she went out to see the women of the land is a little controversial because in its context, it could mean that she was going out to be a little bit of promiscuous in that region. She could have been going out to lure men with imprudence. The only other occurrence of this expression in Genesis comes in chapter 27:46 when Rebekah speaks out against Jacob's marrying one of the women of the land. And so she's not supposed to be like these ladies. And we can't really determine where this is going, but as a commentator once shared, Dinah was at least sailing close to the wind with being a little bit promiscuous amongst the other women in the region. She was at least experiencing or exploring what they were doing. What we can know is that she wasn't supposed to be doing it. She was doing that separated from the people, right, in that area. Now, Shechem was the son of a prominent local official in the region of Canaan. And when he saw Dinah, he was overcome by lust and raped her. Again, this is very tragic, a very, very tragic story. This would have been traumatic just as it is today, but also very insulting to the family at that time period. It would have been a defilement of her completely and made her unclean in that culture, which would have made her less than or a black mark on the family line. However, while the act was certainly brutal, we see that he became obsessed with her. He was drawn to her. That's what the text means. Obsessed with her in his passions. And he wanted to keep her as his wife. This is compared to some other stories later in the Old Testament where a woman was tragically raped and the person just threw her out like garbage. In this case, Dinah is desired by Shechem, right or wrong, because of what happened. He wants to marry her. He does have a desire for her. And so while he wanted to marry her properly, this evil act was already done, and we're not meant to throw it out. But we are meant to note that he did want to make her his wife. And it wasn't just political, it was from a desire he had. In my opinion, it could have been that he was a little bit obsessive with her. There certainly was some unhealthy behavior going on here at minimum, but I'll let you decide that in your own studies. But we do see Shechem as being made out to be a very brutal, yet charming and demanding person. Notice that he spoke to her tenderly. He loved the young woman, but then he was demanding. He went to his father, demanding that he get him this girl for his wife. This phrase, this girl, also means this child in the translation. He was speaking of her lowly. He wasn't speaking of her highly. He was drawn to her, but he was not very encouraging or caring of who she was. So he was this tragic act happened to Dinah by a very brutal act done by the deplorable Shechem, who fell in love with her, whether it was out of lust or of love. He had a desire for her, but then he treated her less than. He was very demanding, but he also kind of pushed into the power that his dad had in the region. So that's where we're at right now. So now we have to look at how his dad reacted. And what they did is they proposed a marriage alliance with Jacob's family, which, remember, in the Old Testament throughout, before this and after this, the Israelites were not supposed to intermarry with other people groups. And so we have to keep that in mind. This is the early stages of that are going to come down later. Now Jacob heard that he had defiled his daughter Dinah, but his sons were with his livestock in the field. So Jacob held his peace until they came. And Hamor, the father of Shechem, went out to Jacob to speak with him. The sons of Jacob had come in from the field as soon as they heard of it, and the men were indignant and very angry, because he had done an outrageous thing in Israel by lying with Jacob's daughter, for such a thing must not be done. So first, let's catch the relational possessive theme here. Jacob and his sons and daughters, his daughter, his sons, sons of Jacob, Jacob's daughter. This is meant to put all the onus on Jacob. So the author wants us to focus on what Jacob's reaction is here and seeing what his kids are doing based on his reaction. So now that the scene is set, the narrator moves us to the perspective of Jacob and his response to the situation. Again, we note that the narrator calls Dinah his daughter, showing the gravity of what was going on. This was Jacob's blood, this offense. Now, most would think that Jacob's anger would shine through immediately. I would hope that many fathers would in this action, and my goodness, to handle it biblically would be very difficult. However, the narrator shows that this was the opposite for Jacob, that Jacob waited until his sons came home. It shines negatively on him and gives some insight on how he viewed his daughter. Again, remember, he didn't really love Leah. It is possible he didn't love her daughter and probably didn't love her boys as much as he loved Rebekah's kids. So that does give us a little peek into the relationship going on here. But also let's remember Isaac and his passivity as a father when it came to Esau and Jacob, way back in the blessing narrative that happened to go on here. But what we do see at minimum is the author, the narrator, is showing us that there wasn't a ton of care from Jacob because he didn't act right away. However, in the meantime, Hamor, the father of Shechem, immediately approaches Jacob to arrange a marital deal. He had his son's best interest in mind, good or bad, for what his son did, and wanted him to maintain what honor he could of his son. We should also note that there's a contrast between Jacob and Hamor here. They're showing what Jacob didn't do, and they're showing what Hamor did do. Jacob, who was Israel at this point, and Hamor, who was a Canaanite, a person not of God. Jacob didn't seem to care much about his daughter's violation or honor, while Hamor worked quickly to honor his son, the violator's honor. Jacob kept quiet while Hamor acted. That's what we need to hone in on here. We also see another contrast to Jacob. His sons were enraged by what happened. They acted immediately when they heard about it. They ran home as soon as they heard what occurred. They showed extreme emotion, and they were not quiet at all about what happened. They were enraged because the men had done an unspeakable thing to Dinah, Jacob's daughter. They were angered as brothers, but also shocked that they would do this to Israel's daughter, to their father's daughter. They expected a little bit more from their dad, and we're going to see this come into play later in the narrative. We notice also that there's a contrast between Jacob and the nation of Israel. Jacob was not called Israel here, even though the story of Israel, of the wrestling with God, just happened before the Esau narrative. He was allowing something that ought not to be done in Israel, in God's people. Jacob was passive again in this situation. So the story continues, but Hamor spoke with them, saying, the soul of my son Shechem longs for your daughter. Please give her to him to be his wife. Make marriages with us, give us your daughters to us, and take our daughters for yourselves. You shall dwell with us, and the land shall be open to you. Dwell and trade in it, and get property in it. Shechem also said to her father and to her brothers, let me find favor in your eyes, and whatever you say to me, I will give. Ask me for as great a bride price and gift as you will, and I will give whatever you say to me. Only give me the young woman to be my wife. So there is a lot going on here, all right? So let's unpack this. Hamor addresses Jacob courteously, but without apology. Notice he didn't give any admission of what had happened. He didn't apologize for what his son did. He didn't even mention it. He was more interested in connecting these two tribes because it could have delved into a bigger problem. He doesn't mention even Dinah in the story. He doesn't mention that she was still at his house. Dinah had not returned. She was still at Shechem's home, being held captive in a way. Now, we're not sure if she was there on her own or her own volition or if she was being held, but we at least know that she wasn't here present. She didn't get to come home, period. However, Hamor tries to show that Shechem has a free will desire to marry Dinah. And this was an effort to, one, save his son's face, to not shame him, but to also give a little bit of respect to Dinah, that that Shechem wanted to make things right because he did love her genuinely, or lusted after her genuinely, whatever way that it goes. Now in verse 9, we see Hamor takes this a bit further and proposes meshing the two people groups together and promoting intermarriage. Again, a big no-no for God, both before this and then later in the Old Testament. God was not okay with this. We see that in Deuteronomy chapter 7, verse 3. You shall not intermarry with them, giving your daughters to their sons or taking their daughters for your sons, for they will turn away your sons from following me to serve other gods. Then the anger of the Lord would be kindled against you, and he would destroy you quickly. It is not okay for God's people to marry outside of the family. And again, you have these Canaanites, these people who are known for mystic idol worship, trying to intermarry into God's people. Again, keep your eyes on Jacob. What's Jacob's response? Well, Hamor then uses economic benefits to try and persuade Jacob. This would bring freedom, growth, prosperity, safety. Again, talking about how you can get land and how you can dwell and trade in it and intermingle with the people. However, Hamor unknowingly is trying to provide things that he can't provide. These are things that God had provided or promised to Jacob in the covenant promise. He promised it to Abraham. He promised it to Isaac. He promised it to him at Bethel. He reasserted it when he named him Israel, saying, you will get these things. I will give these things to you, Jacob: land, prosperity, safety, freedom. However, what Hamor here is offering is a cheap knockoff version of God's promise. Again, keep your eyes on Jacob, though. What is Jacob's response going to be? Well, verses 11 through 12, we see as these two men are talking, these two patriarchs of their tribes are talking, Shechem appears in the conversation and shows his impatience by butting in and declaring that he wants to solve the problem. With an impassioned outburst, he brings them back to the issue at hand. He wants their sister, Jacob's daughter, and is willing to pay for that in whatever way he can, whether it's through money or through method. In Mesopotamian culture, it's important to note that a financial marriage present to the family of the bride would have legitimized the union of a marriage. So he wanted to arrange a bride price to be able to procure her as his wife and to make this official in ancient Near Earth cultures. But again, what he's doing is not appropriate because at that time period, the father of the bride would be the one that would set the price. There would be a betrothal process that they would have gone through. A bride price would have been agreed upon, given. There would have been a marriage ceremony, and there would have been, as we saw with him and Leah and Rachel, there would have been a week of kind of observing that marriage to secure it legally. Shechem is jumping right in, offering a bride price to both the family and Dinah and showing his colors a little bit again of who he was in his character. So verse 13, the sons of Jacob answered Shechem and his father Hamor deceitfully, because he had defiled their sister Dinah. They said to them, we cannot do this thing to give our sister to one who is uncircumcised, for that would be a disgrace to us. Only on this condition will we agree with you, that you will become as we are by every male among you being circumcised. Then we will give our daughters to you, and we will take your daughters to ourselves, and we will dwell with you and become one people. So Shechem's passionate outbursts caused Jacob's sons to react, not Jacob himself. Notice Jacob has been quiet ever since he found out what happened. He's not leading his family. This should give us a little bit of interest back to Isaac, what happened there. And even after all he's been through, Jacob is still not walking in faith and doing the right things. But now the boys are jumping in. His boys are jumping in and engaging in this discussion. They were riled up by what they were hearing, and they offered a deceitful response to Hamor and to Shechem. Now, it's not laid out here fully. It will be laid out later, but it is tied to this circumcision thing we're going to see here, and it's an allusion of what to come. There's a Hebrew term being used here called merma, which implies treachery for that word deceitful. This is a sense that they were planning to do something evil to Hamor and Shechem, and it really does resemble their father, whose name means he deceives. Their actions here were that they were about to go beyond what they stated. They wanted to do something wrong. So as a precondition, well, what was it that they wanted to do wrong? They said, well, to marry Dinah, Shechem and the townsfolk were going to have to be circumcised. In chapter 17, circumcision is introduced as the sign of eternal covenant with God established with Abraham. So they're basically saying you cannot marry into our family unless you're circumcised, unless you become Israelites. So while Hamor stressed the economic advantages of marriage, the brothers were stressing the religious impediments to marriage. They were more focused on the religious aspect of this. And this was a good thing. However, remember the treachery or the deceitfulness. That's going to come into play. They still haven't addressed what occurred, although that's where their deceitfulness will stem from. They'll address it later, sinfully. but they are focused on a good thing, which is, no, you cannot intermarry unless you're an Israelite. For God's people to marry the uncircumcised would be an embarrassment and would open them to ridicule. So here they're using this key stipulation in the Abrahamic covenant that all of your males must be circumcised to, one, solve a problem, but not the correct way. They're solving a problem with vengeance in their hearts. And Jacob's sons would only agree if this occurred. To them, the marriage wasn't about the money. It's a question about religious identity. And again, not a bad thing, but how they go about it is very bad. So verse 17, but if you will not listen to us and be circumcised, then we will take our daughter, and we will be gone. Their words pleased Hamor and Hamor's son Shechem. And the young man did not delay to do the thing, because he delighted in Jacob's daughter. Now he was the most honored of all his father's house. Here the heat intensity increases. If the Shechemites do not comply, the brothers will take their sister. This is most likely a veiled threat of physical force. They will come seize their sister. They're saying, look, we're going to come get her if you don't agree to this. There's going to be a big problem. It's an early hint of the brothers' true motives that may and will happen eventually in the story. And then later in verses 18 through 19, we see whether they were offended or threatened, Hamor and Shechem agreed to the terms. And the phrase used here can also be shared as because he was infatuated with Jacob's daughter. That was the reason for Shechem. He was obsessed with her. He had a deep longing for her that went beyond love and a healthy posture. It was sinful. There was a depth to this that was ugly. So in the end, his will does matter. Shechem's will does matter because of the high honor he had in his father's culture, and he believed he could get these things done, and it would have made him look good also in his father's house. So the story continues on. Hamor and Shechem put terms to the marriage alliance to the townsfolk. They have to go back to the townspeople and talk about this agreement. So Hamor and his son Shechem came to the gate of their city and spoke to the men of their city, saying, these men are at peace with us. Let them dwell in the land and trade in it. For behold, the land is large enough for them. Let us take their daughters as wives, and let us give them our daughters. So with the deal in place, they brought the agreement back. It was common in Mesopotamian times for public land deals to be shared with the elders and the public at the same time, because many were involved in how their land was going to be managed. So they did need approval from the whole townsfolk, even though Hamor was a government official in his culture. It is here that the two begin to unpack the deal with them. However, they are also deceitful because they leave out some very important things that occurred in the actual negotiations. Verse 22, only on this condition will the men agree to dwell with us to become one people. When every male among us is circumcised as they are circumcised, will not their livestock, their property, and all their beasts be ours? Only let us agree with them, and they will dwell with us. And all who went out of the gate of his city listened to Hamor and his son Shechem, and every male was circumcised, all who went out of the gate of his city. Well, what did they leave out? They did not mention that the Israelites could acquire possessions in the land. Notice they said that we will get their property, not that they can get property. But they also left out the veiled threat of violence by the brothers, that if they didn't agree, there would be a consequence to this circumstance. We then can back up and see that the circumcision stipulation was shared. However, the father and son duo were still focused on the economic benefits as their tool of persuasion. So it wasn't a religious thing, as the brothers were trying to get them to focus on. To them, it was still money, and they were trying to persuade the townsfolk to look at it financially through means, not through a religion. Now, it seems that these two were trying to fool both the Israelites and their people at this time period to get what they wanted. However, whatever their true motives were, the townfolks did agree to the circumcision in the end as readily as Hamor and Shechem had, because we see that they went ahead and did it, and they were circumcised. So now we have the big climax of the story, where Jacob's sons come and rape the town. And that word is meant to be used to illustrate what Shechem did to Dinah. But we're going to see a distinct difference here. Verse 25, on the third day, when they were sore, two of the sons of Jacob, Simeon and Levi, Dinah's brothers, took their swords and came against the city while it felt secure and killed all the males. They killed Hamor and his son Shechem with the sword and took Dinah out of Shechem's house and went away. The sons of Jacob came upon the slain and plundered the city, because they had defiled their sister. They took their flocks and their herds, their donkeys, and whatever was in the city and in the field, all their wealth, all their little ones, and their wives, all that was in the houses, they captured and plundered. So here the deed has been done with the Shechemites, as they've agreed to become one people with Israel. They agreed to the intermarriage. They submitted to circumcision, and now they were healing. I didn't highlight it, but notice that third day, threes are typically 3 sevens, holy numbers in the Bible. It's showing them the third day, this day, something that was supposed to be holy, something tragic occurred. In that moment, 2 of Jacob's boys mounted their attack on the people. It wasn't all his sons, it was Simeon and Levi that did it. Now, although the act was done to Dinah, and because it was horrible, this was also a treacherous act, because it was an attack without honor, as the city felt that they were in good standing. Notice that they said there that they felt secure. They felt that things were fine. And also, remember, this beef was really between Hamor and Shechem and the boys, not really the whole town. So what we're going to see here is Simeon and Levi take us much further than just one-on-one justice, which would have been acceptable in that culture. I'm not saying acceptable in God's eyes, but in that culture, eye for an eye was pretty common. They're going well beyond that. It was a disproportionate act of rage and revenge. So while Shechem violated Dinah, the 2 brothers killed all the men in the city, and Shechem and Hamor the father. This is not justice. This is revenge. We can also note that the narrator has separated the sons from Jacob, noting that they were Dinah's brothers. It was Jacob's failure to act that provoked them to behave in such an extreme way. He had not loved Leah or her daughter, Dinah, but they did. They were doing it for their sister, because their father had not acted. They took things in their own hands. So this whole time, we also see that Dinah had been at Shechem's house. Whether willingly or not, she had been there and held there since her rape by Shechem. So she has not been with her family, and they came and got her. They did deliver on their deceitful promise. But again, this was not justice. This was, again, all acts are horrible here, but this was above and beyond when it comes to justice that was acceptable. We also know that because that she was with him, they had been negotiating under duress this whole time. So this whole time there was this tension. They did not have their sister. There was a high stakes in the back of the brothers' minds this entire season. But also notice no interaction from Jacob, only quiet. In the end, both Shechem and Hamor were killed, along with many, many others. Now, while at this point only 2 brothers had acted grievously, the other brothers now jump in, and they joined in sinfully and began to plunder the city. While the others did not murder, they certainly robbed. This phrase plundered here is used in the context of making war, an act of retribution or rage. Although all of Jacob's sons were involved in the deception of Hamor and Shechem, only Simeon and Levi are involved in the slaughter of all the males. While all the brothers are involved in plundering the city, Jacob later attaches particular guilt to Simeon and Levi for the massacre of these men in Shechem, which we'll see in a minute. And you'll see this also come up again later in Genesis 49, 5-7. And it also explains why both brothers here are passed over in favor of their younger sibling, Judah, later in the narrative. You'll see that in the Joseph story. But either way, all the boys here jumped in. Every single one of them sinned immensely. Simeon and Levi went above and beyond their sin. But again, it's because Jacob didn't engage. There was nothing Jacob did. I'm not saying the boys did the right thing and they're not off the hook, but he did not step up either and lead. So verse 30, when the story kind of starts to come to a close here, we see that then Jacob said to Simeon and Levi, "You have brought trouble on me by making me stink to the inhabitants of the land. The Canaanites and the Perizzites, my numbers are few, and if they gather themselves against me and attack me, I shall be destroyed, both I and my household." But they said, "Should he, Jacob, treat our sister like a prostitute?" Now this was a heated exchange between the father and his sons. Because of their actions, they brought ruin on him, or akar, right? That's the word here, akar. They brought ruin on him. This is a sense of bringing personal or national disaster in the Old Testament. This was a travesty that the boys had brought on their father. His strong rebuke springs from a very weak heart, however, because he's fearful of how the tribes around him will react. Jacob's fear of those around him is much similar to the fear that was shared earlier when his fear of Esau in chapter 32, verse 12. He's fearful that he's going to be killed. Now, I think we've all agreed that fear is a reasonable, acceptable reaction, especially with what occurred. However, he does not do the right thing still. He does not condemn his boys for the massacre, abuse of the circumcision rite, or for even breaching a tribal contract. He protests that their actions have now made him unpopular in the region, that have left him open to attack. He did not care what happened. Also, and I think this is the saddest part, he is still not concerned about his daughter's rape or the prospect of intermarriage with the Canaanites. It is not mentioned here that he asked where Dinah was. He's only concerned about his own skin and what the boys have brought on him and on his nation. Again, It's reasonable to see why he's fearful, but man, oh man, what is he afraid of? That's the big question. Is he afraid of the right things, the godly things, or the things that are obsessing of himself? And I don't agree with the boys, but notice that the brothers responded very directly. They referred to Dinah first as our sister. They took ownership of their sister, realizing that there was a separation between Jacob and Dinah. It's another insight into this family tension going on here. They're accusing their father of acting like a pimp, basically. He was willing to overlook the abuse of his daughter for the reception of gifts and wealth. It can be insinuated that the last words in this story are meant to ridicule and condemn both Shechem and Jacob, because this is how the story ends. However, in the end, Jacob, his boys, and the nation of Israel are now all marked with significant shame in the region. And while Simeon and Levi were strongly against the violation of their sister and the prospect of intermarriage with the Canaanites, again, like I shared earlier, was very biblical. They did it with rage and not justice. So there's this tragic story involving the horrific act of something that occurred to one of Jacob's children that he seemed to be distant from, that he never wanted to address. And now, through all these things, without him acting and doing what God had wanted him to do, to lead, to be Israel, he, again, his passivity, much like his father Isaac, has caused all these problems. And now they're in a really bad spot. They're surrounded in a region where they're now known to break tribal treaties, to murder, to go above and beyond when it comes to justice, if Dinah's case was known. And now you have an entire townspeople that was destroyed tragically and horrifically too, because they took advantage of circumcision inappropriately. So again, a very bad situation going here. But God, again, as always, does amazing things. And so now Jacob moves into a new stage of his development. And this is where he's going to head back to Bethel. When I taught on Bethel 2 lessons ago, we discussed how that was when he was running from his brother Esau up to Laban, to his uncle. And he had this interaction with God in Bethel where God promised that he was going to protect him and guide him and love him. And Jacob still didn't have full faith. He said, well, if you do those things, then I will worship you. But he didn't worship him in that moment. This is where we are. He's now going back to Bethel, going back to restoration. Now he's being restored to God, where his father Isaac is still alive in the story. Unfortunately, though, Jacob's sons reflect the character of the younger Jacob at this point. So their son like father when their father was younger. And this factor plays a huge role in the beginning of the narrative coming up in the Joseph story in the future. It's against the backdrop of Jacob's fear of the nations that this next section is going to occur, and God would encourage the patriarch to move forward from his fear into trusting him and departing for Bethel. So let's take a look at how he responds. So again, the outline here, we have 4 sections: a divine call to go to Bethel, Jacob's obedience. We have a reaffirmation of the promises, Jacob's worship at Bethel, the birth of Benjamin and the sad death and burial of Rachel, Reuben's shameful act, we'll touch on that one, Jacob's sons, which is a genealogy, and then the death and burial of Isaac by his 2 sons. And it's one of the more touching stories, I think, at the end of the major Jacob narrative that's we're going to come up on here. So let's go into the first act here, the divine call to go to Bethel. So God said to Jacob, "Arise, go up to Bethel and dwell there. Make an altar there to the God who appeared to you when you fled from your brother Esau." Although given the name Israel, Jacob is still referred to as Jacob in the narration. So this shows a still developing patriarch. He was not yet, again, remember, God called him Israel already, but now he's referring to him to Jacob. So he wasn't really there yet. It shows that this will be an extremely important thing to keep in mind later in the passage. Now, back when Jacob tricked Esau, his mother and father told him to up and go and stay with his uncle Laban. The terms used here are meant to echo that same commission. The terms used by God, go up to Bethel and dwell there. However, instead of having tones of fleeing, the term go up has the connotation of a pilgrimage. So he wasn't running away from fear. He was telling him to stop running. He was telling him to go towards God, go on a pilgrimage to where you had your first interaction with me. That's what God is saying to him. So here, Jacob is being reminded of his religious obligations to God. And this is the first time a patriarch was told to build an altar, the very first time, a place of worship. However, because Jacob is still developing, it is also similar to when God told a still developing Abraham to offer a burnt offering, right? That sacrificial thing. This is a developing patriarch. It was a great test of obedience, and this is similar for Jacob to what God did with Abraham. Now, while this may seem easier than preparing the sacrifice Abraham did, again, the Isaac story, which is tragic, which ended very, very well for Isaac, We have to remember that Jacob was traveling in fear after what happened in Shechem. So it may have taken more courage than what we see here because he was fearful and he was surrounded by the people who could take care of him. And now he was being told to pack up everything and hit the road, which would make them vulnerable. So let's talk about Jacob's response. Jacob finally was obedient to what God wanted him to do. So Jacob said to his household and to all who are with him, "Put away the foreign gods that are among you and purify yourselves and change your garments. Then let us arise and go up to Bethel, so that I may make there an altar to the God who answers me in the day of my distress and has been there with me wherever I have gone." So they gave to Jacob all the foreign gods that they had and the rings that were in their ears. Jacob hid them under the terebinth tree that was near Shechem. So a bunch of things here. Sacred or not, Jacob was as prompt, or scared or not, Jacob was as prompt as Abraham and got to work immediately. He went to tell his family that we have to get moving, and he right away got them ready to interact with God. See, worship of other gods was always incompatible with serving the true God. And Jacob's instructions to his household are meant to prepare his people for entering God's presence. It was a very, very big endeavor. Here, Jacob is reminiscing on his flight from Esau and the vow he made to God the first time in Bethel. So when the prayer offered the first time was answered, the duty of Jacob was bound to fulfill the promise he had made, which he is now implying he's going to do. We must also note that Jacob's profession of God is made in the present tense. Not only did God care for him in the time of Esau, but also in the shadows of Shechem. That God is taking care of Jacob, and Jacob is finally trusting God because God is answering him. It's not passive, it's active. Now, his family responded as requested, which is very interesting because of what we've seen so far in this family dynamic. They gave him all the things that were used in idolatrous worship. Jacob then took those items and buried them. Now, this phrase here insinuates that this was a permanent burial. It wasn't like he was going to come back and dig it back up. He was putting it to death. He was disposing of those items forever. In addition, the mention of Shechem could mean that the rings and idols were procured by his sons in the pillaging of Shechem. So in a way, Jacob is finally addressing the sin of his family in that moment, in that act, burying it forever and moving onward from that evil that occurred in the region. So verse 5, as they journeyed, a terror from God fell upon the cities that were around them, so that they did not pursue the sons of Jacob. And Jacob came to Luz, that is Bethel, which is in the land of Canaan, and he and all the people who were with him. And there he built an altar and called the place El Bethel, because there God had revealed himself to him when he fled from his brother. And Deborah, Rebekah's nurse, died, and she was buried under an oak below Bethel. So he called its name Alon Bakuth. Now, finally, Jacob moved in obedience to God's call. Jacob had most likely lingered longer than he should have in the region surrounding Shechem out of fear, and that kind of kept him from moving on. And we could see that because those nations or whatever was around them were being addressed here. Now that he was in moving obedience, God had closed those nations or those people groups off from any harm they wanted to do to the Israelites, to Jacob. Now, this divine terror, a terror fell from God. It's really cool. This is similar to what we'll see later in the Old Testament when Israel would conquer land. When we see it in Exodus, Deuteronomy, Joshua, the Canaanites were paralyzed in fear at those moments as well through a terror from God. This is a supernatural divine interaction by God to protect his people so they will do what he wants them to do. Now, the mention of Luz, which is not really necessary, is again connecting the story to Jacob's first experience at Bethel. So we do have to go all the way back to that first experience and recognize that this story is meant to be shared in the shadow of that first interaction. It's a repetition, again, that's important. And then we also see from verse 1 all the way up to here that Bethel was repeated multiple times, showing that this is a very special place that God spoke, theophany, where God had an interaction with man, with Jacob. Now, Jacob fulfills the command of God and built the altar. He went and did it. And while the fulfillment of his vow earlier in Genesis 28, 20 through 22 is not specifically mentioned, that was the vow that if you do this for me, I'll do that for you, basically, that I will set up a pillar and you'll be my God if you do the things for me. It doesn't say that he actually did that directly. We can assume, safely assume, frankly, that Jacob kept his promise because of the divine blessing that was to come afterwards here. Now also, let's note the words revealed himself. It shows that Jacob's experience with God the first time was a prophetic experience. So it is possible that this is a prophetic reference to Jacob as being a prophet. That's where a lot of discussion can be had there, but for the sake of time, we're going to have to keep moving on here. Now, verse 8, there is now this odd section that we see about the death of Rebekah that pops up in the middle of the story. Rebekah's nurse, someone who is never mentioned prior to this. Deborah did not come up in the narrative at all in Scripture until this moment. And it's very unique because her presence with Jacob suggests a few things. One, it suggests that she had been sent to him by Rebekah in fulfillment of her promise back in 2745. So mom sent her favorite son, this nurse, to go care for his family. But also it insinuates that Rebekah's death it could have occurred because it's never recorded in the Old Testament. It is mentioned later in her burial, later in Genesis 49, but it could mean that she died in Padan Aram, and despite her hopes, she never saw her favorite son again, and that's why she sent Deborah. But either way, we see this tragic moment where Rebekah's out of the picture. Deborah is dead. She dies on this journey, and it gives a nod to her. Now, what's important is that she gets buried near a tree that's famously known as the Oak of Deborah, or also the Tree of Weeping. Scholars kind of argue where that's located, but what we need to know is the name of it's the most important thing. It's a place of deep sorrow. This was a sad place because more weeping would occur later in this journey, right? Because there were more deaths that were going to come up in this chapter. So let's look at the reaffirmation of promises by God. God appeared to Jacob again, and when he came from Padan Aram, and blessed him. And God said to him, "Your name is Jacob. No longer shall your name be called Jacob, but Israel shall be your name." So he called his name Israel. And God said to him, "I am God Almighty. Be fruitful and multiply. A nation and a company of nations shall come from you, and kings shall come from your own body. The land that I give to Abraham and to Isaac I will give to you, and I will give the land to your offspring after you." So these verses bring the account of Jacob's developing relationship with God to an important climax. Jacob's return to Bethel is accompanied by further divine appearances by God. Just like Abraham's 3-day pilgrimage, Jacob's pilgrimage climaxes with God's blessing. His name change accounts hinges on what happened in Genesis 32, 29, and it is a continuation of Jacob's new identity. It was a triumphant moment where Jacob's development as a follower of God has risen to its climax. Now, Jacob will mess up again in the future. He's human. However, this is now the promise is secure with him fully. God has fully revealed that to him. And Jacob hears a very similar blessing by God given to him by his father Isaac and to Abraham by God. It is the strongest statement of God's promises that he had ever heard up to this point, summing up and adding to what he had been said to him throughout this entire narrative. So this is the promise of God, again, given directly to Jacob. The one that was given to Abraham, the one that was given to Isaac, now fully affirmed and given to Jacob. Well, Jacob's response, he worshiped. Then God went up from him in the place where he had spoken with him, and Jacob set up a pillar in the place where he had spoken with him, a pillar of stone. He poured out a drink offering on it and poured oil on it. So Jacob called the name of the place where God had spoken with him Bethel. Here, God departed, and again, as he had similarly done in Genesis 17:22 with Abraham, again, another theophany in Scripture. And we see that this is the first time Jacob's encounter with God led to another building of a pillar of stone, just like the first time, but something very different. This was more of a worshipful moment, a heavy worshipful moment. Yes, he set up a pillar of stone, a reminder, but also now he did a ritualistic reverence to God through the pouring out of a drink offering and then pouring oil on the pillar to show that this is a very special holy place, a place of reaffirming a memorable movement by God. And then again, he reaffirms the name of that place, Bethel, very important. So then we have another swing in the story as now the Jacob and Israel, they move away from that area, from Bethel. And so let's pick up here, verse 16. Then they journeyed from Bethel when they were still some distance from Ephrath. Rachel went into labor, and she had hard labor. And when her labor was at its hardest, the midwife said to her, "Do not fear, for you have another son." And as her soul was departing, for she was dying, she called his name Benani. But his father called him Benjamin. So when he was finished worshiping, Jacob left Bethel and traveled towards Ephrath. And then sadly, tragedy struck. Rachel will go into labor somewhere north of where Jerusalem would eventually be. This is important because Benjamin's going to be born. And this is important because he's going to be born into his tribal region, his geographic region. It gives him title to this area. It was a bit north of Jerusalem, making that the tribe of Benjamin, his region, his area. Unfortunately, though, something was not right with the labor, and it was very deadly. At the pinnacle of the birthing process, her midwife tried to bring her encouragement, which was very common, by telling her she had a son. Now, this was huge because, one, having a son in this time period was a thing of honor and a great blessing by God on a woman. But also, two, it was important because back in Genesis 30:24, when Rachel gave birth to Joseph, she did exclaim to God, "May the Lord add to me another son." this was a answered prayer for her. It was a moment where the prayer was answered. However, while it was a beautiful answer to a prayer, it was a tragic moment because she was going to die. At that time period, we have to remember that death during childbirth was tragically common. So for them, it wouldn't have been as shocking as being a reader at that time period. For us, it's horrible because of modern medicine. However, it was still alarming to the readers at the time and still a painful scene. And so we must remember that in Genesis 30, verse 1, Rachel told Jacob to give me children or I shall die. And now, and sadly, it was ultimately the gift of children that would kill her. As she died, she called her new son Benani, meaning son of sorrow. This sorrow is one of mourning. However, Jacob, knowing that this boy was the son of his favorite wife, called him Benjamin, meaning son of the right. Anything that's referred to the right side in an ancient Near Eastern culture meant that was the favorite or the lucky side. So he was a blessed human being to Jacob and to his mother. But still a very tragic scene and a tragic story that's unfolding here. So Rachel died, and she was buried on the way to Ephrath, which is Bethlehem, and Jacob set up a pillar over her tomb. It is the pillar of Rachel's tomb, which is there to this day. So not a ton to pull out here. It's pretty straightforward, but Rachel died and was buried in or near Bethlehem, and she was buried along this journey. So they didn't stay there. They had to keep moving. Jacob would set up a pillar and a reminder of Rachel's death over her grave. This was a repeated phrase we see here about her pillar and about her death. And this was meant to be a thing that lasted forever. The idea of this is it was something that shows a deep grief to Jacob, a very painful moment for him, a very horrific moment because he loved her. It was his favorite wife. I mean, it's odd to say that today, but that is the case in the biblical narrative. His favorite wife had just died. And keep in mind, carrying this brand new infant as a father, a promised child that she begged God from and begged him from too. So a very sad and somber moment. Well, then it takes another weird swing here into Reuben's shameful act. And this is a very short passage, but there's tons we can get out of it here. Israel journeyed on and pitched his tent beyond the Tower of Eder. While Israel lived in that land, Reuben went and lay with Bilhah, his father's concubine, and Israel heard of it. Now notice here, he went from being referenced as Jacob to now being referenced as Israel. All right, so Jacob, the mourning Jacob, moved on as the holy Israel, moving forward in what God had called him to do. And he was traveling to go see his father Isaac. That's what he was doing. However, there's this weird turn where Reuben acts sinfully in lust and greed. So I'm going to unpack this for you just quickly because of the way the text works. But after some time, Reuben acted sensually, but the context here is showing that this is more of a matter, this is more than just lust that's going on. By doing what he did, Reuben prevented Rachel's maid from succeeding Rachel as his father's favorite wife. Reuben resented that Jacob did not honor his mother Leah and laid claim to authority over his father. By doing this, not only did he block the concubine becoming the favorite wife, but also blocked the ability of him to claim any authority over his father. So Reuben was kind of puffing his chest saying, okay, now I'm in charge, I'm the firstborn, and he was asserting a claim to his father's estate. However, no matter what, incest is strictly condemned throughout the Old Testament. Reuben committed a very shameful act here, and that's what's being noted. It was a turning point in the rebellion between the sons and the father. However, while Israel heard of the act, Jacob, he remained silent. Notice he was still quiet. Jacob did not respond. We know that because it shifts again here in a minute to another narrative. This is similar to what happened in Shechem. So a couple questions need to come from this. Well, is Jacob's indifference to Bilhah's abuse the same as he was with Dinah's? Or does he care, but is now unable to exercise authority over his sons because of what Reuben did? These are great questions that are very important because there are things that are going to help us unpack very big moments in the Joseph story that are coming up in chapters 37 through 50. This episode suggests that not only does tension exist between Jacob and his sons, but also between the sons of Rachel and Bilhah and the sons of Leah. So also throughout the Joseph story, we must note that Reuben is portrayed as a hero trying to save Joseph, which is very intriguing. But this story shows a very dark side to Reuben, one that will catch up to him later in Genesis 49, 2 through 3, because Jacob's not silent forever. He's going to turn the firstborn's blessing into a curse on his deathbed. So this will come back later in the Joseph story. So keep that in mind when we get to that later in the summer. So now let's talk through Jacob's sons real quick. Now the sons of Jacob were 12, the sons of Leah, Reuben, Jacob's firstborn, Simeon, Levi, Judah, Issachar, and Zebulun. The sons of Rachel, Joseph and Benjamin. The sons of Bilhah, Rachel's servant, Dan and Naphtali. The sons of Zilpah, Leah's servant, Gad and Asher. These were the sons of Jacob who were born to him in Padan Aram. Now, this list of Jacob's sons may seem out of place, but it is preparing the way now for the switch in the narrative to the Joseph story. However, strictly speaking, we need to note that Benjamin here is not from Padan Aram. He is excluded because of what we just saw. So keep that in mind because it does have important biblical context later in Genesis, but also throughout the entirety of Scripture, especially with Jesus. So you have this transition now saying those stories are done. We're moving on to a new set of stories in Genesis. However, one thing has to occur, and this closes out the Isaac narrative completely, all right? And that's the death and burial of Isaac. And I love this part, by his two sons. And Jacob came to his father Isaac at Mamre, or Kiriath Arba, that is Hebron, where Abraham and Isaac had sojourned. Now the days of Isaac were 180 years, and Isaac breathed his last, and he died and was gathered to his people, old and full of days. And his sons Esau and Jacob buried him. Now eventually Jacob did make it to his father Isaac's house. Isaac had moved north from Beersheba, where he was last heard of. And the geographical repetition and mention of Abraham and Isaac's travels show that this was a very special moment, special place, where the greatest promises had been made to them. Also note that Rebekah is not mentioned in the story. Again, another allusion that she had passed away at this point. Now these verses echo Genesis 25:7-9 very closely. As the estranged brothers Ishmael and Isaac joined together to bury Abraham, so also the reconciliation of Jacob and Esau is reaffirmed in the final act of jointly burying their father. The text implies that Isaac was buried in the ancestral grave at Machpelah, but this is not made explicit later into Genesis 49:29-32. But what we have here is a family joined back together, a tragic, broken family. Brothers joined back together to bury a father who, remember, Isaac loved Esau more, but still Jacob came back. Jacob was there. The loving mother was gone. And you have these brothers again burying a patriarch. Same story unfolded with Ishmael and Isaac back when they buried Abraham. Another tragic story of a mother loving different kids and a father having to make difficult choices. So again, a very sad scene here of the boys burying their father. He was buried with his people. Isaac was buried with his people. So this wasn't just the boys. It was a big affair, a big endeavor, but burying them at a holy place. So you might be saying, well, boy, that was a lot. We've only covered 2 chapters. We have Genesis 36. Well, we do have Esau's descendants. And again, this is another important bridge in the Joseph story, but also later into Exodus. So this is an important reason why it's here. So I'm going to lay this up for you here real quick. This is basically a lineage breakdown of all the descendants from Esau's family. Largely through genealogy lists like this, this chapter provides a brief description of Esau and his descendants. The information here includes the narrator's interest in Esau. It precedes the much fuller, more important accounts of Jacob's descendants. So the location of this material resembles that of the same stuff in Genesis 25:12-18, where information about Ishmael's descendants comes before the longer account of Isaac's family. It's meant to be like kind of a trail off to here's what happened. But Edom is very important. Now, what I'm not going to do is I'm not going to read all these because it's just me sitting here trying to read names that, frankly, some of them I can't pronounce correctly. But if you'd like to, chapter 36, please go ahead and read through that in your comfort. But we're going to kind of zip through here for the sake of time. But here is the family tree. That's what I want to show this to you right here. So Esau had a big family, huge family. Now, the author of Genesis usually writes about minor characters before concentrating in detail on the main participants of a unique family line. That's going to be Jacob's family and the Joseph story coming up here. But particular attention is given to the presence of both chiefs and kings among Esau's descendants who coexist alongside the Horites, the original inhabitants of the Seir. Eventually, however, Esau's descendants assumed control of Seir, renaming it Edom. So this is important because we do see that the promise given by Isaac to Esau, that Esau, while under his brother's thumb, will prosper as well off the land and also have a family line. This is proof that that does occur. Again, you have the long line of his family here to the right here, over here down, many wives, many children, many kings, many things like that. Again, also too, the setting is important. Right here, Edom, there is a promised land. This is a setting of Edom during Exodus, so it would have been right around here during the Exodus narrative. So Edom did have a place, but again, the land, while he prospered, was kind of not the best. So that's what's most important. We have to keep that in mind, especially when we get to Exodus and later in Israelite history. We do know that the Edomites did get their revenge, as they did come in and battle with Jerusalem and win. They did go and sack the brother. He did remove the yoke from his brother in his family line. But again, also very tragic, and God did not love that, as we see later in the Minor Prophets in Scripture. So at this point, the Joseph story begins. And I'm finished. I don't have more to share with you because Pastor Ryan next week is going to jump into that story. So I want to thank you all very much for the opportunity to walk through Genesis chapter 34, 35, and then to kind of briskly walk through 36. Looking forward to joining you in a couple weeks where we continue in the Joseph narrative into the last patriarch story of the Genesis study this summer. Thank you so much. I love you, and I'm grateful for you. God bless.